This is part 4 of the second lecture for Module 8 from the Apologia General Science book. We're continuing to look at the different problems with the theory of uniformitarianism, and the sixth one is that uniformitarianists must believe evolution occurred, and there is no evidence for evolution in the fossil record. Now, how can we make such a claim that there's no evidence for evolution in the fossil record? Well, the fossil record should be filled with intermediate links between one type of creature and another. If creatures were evolving and changing into new creatures, we should have a lot of fossils of these intermediate stages. This is necessary to prove the theory of evolution. Well, what we find is that there's truly only a few examples of such creatures in the fossil record, and those are highly questionable and can be explained in other ways. Therefore, by the end of this discussion here, I think you can agree that the fossil record offers no evidence for evolution. So let's look at what examples there are in the fossil record of what could be thought of as intermediate links. The first one is this figure shown in the book, which is the evolutionary view of fish giving rise to amphibians. So this is what the uniformitarianist lays out to show how a fish turned into an amphibian. The first creature at the top, over time, its offspring began to look like the second creature, and then its offspring looked like this one. Then its offspring over time looked like this, and its offspring looked like this. So this is how the uniformitarianist, the evolutionist, explains this evolutionary process and claims that these three middle creatures would be the intermediate links between the fish at the top and the amphibian at the bottom. And then, when you look at this, it's like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But if you look at this a little bit differently, and you look at just these top three creatures, and you said, what is this? What are these? Well, it's pretty simple to just say, you know what? They're all fish that have fins. Yes, they are different. But you know what? Looking at all the fish we have today, look at the tremendous variety there is. And just because they're different doesn't mean that they evolved from each other. Likewise, if you look at the bottom two creatures here, and you say, what are those? You would say, those are amphibian with legs and claws. So even though the evolutionists can look at this and say, here's these intermediate links, it's also possible to say, this is just a picture that has some fish and has some amphibians. And yes, there are some similarities, but that does not mean that they necessarily change from fish into amphibians. Another example given in the book of an intermediate link is the Archaeopteryx. Archaeopteryx, I think is how you'd say that. Well, this particular fossil here shows a feather that this creature had feathers like a bird. It had teeth like a reptile. It had claws like a reptile. It had a tail like a reptile. Therefore, the evolutionist thinks this is the intermediate link between birds and reptiles. But if we had an artist who drew a picture of what this creature probably looked like, we would see this. And I ask you, if you saw a creature like this today, what would you call it? You'd call it a bird. You wouldn't call this thing a bird reptile. It's just a bird that has some characteristics that we don't see in birds today. But just because it's different from birds of today doesn't mean it's the intermediate link between a bird and a reptile. Again, I thought about this some more and I thought, okay, let me go out on internet and see what the evolutionist has to say about these intermediate links. Are there some other examples out there that maybe Dr. Weil didn't put in the book that maybe are a little more convincing than these two? Because these two of the fish to amphibians and this bird-reptile link here, those I can understand don't necessarily provide the evidence that we need. So I went out looking, and I went to this particular website, evolution.berkeley.edu. So this is from the University of California at Berkeley, and obviously from an evolutionary viewpoint. Now, instead of calling them intermediate links, they call them transition forms, but that is the same thing. Here's their definition off of their website. It says, fossils are organisms that show the intermediate states between an ancestral form and that of its descendants. And those are referred to as transitional forms. So it's exactly the same thing that we've been calling intermediate links. And then they make this claim that there are numerous examples of transitional forms in the fossil record, providing an abundance of evidence for change over time. So I thought, okay, if they're putting together this website, don't you think that they would take their very best example of a transitional form or an intermediate link to prove that these things exist in the fossil record? To me, that seems like they would take their best example. Therefore, this first example that they give on their website, I'm going to assume is the best that they have. So let's look at this. Here was their example of a transitional form. This was a skull of a Pakicetus, which, according to their radiometric dating, is probably 50 million years old. Listen, look at this description here that they give of this. The Pakicetus is described as an early ancestor to modern whales. Although Pakicetids were land mammals, it is clear that they are related to whales and dolphins based on a number of specializations of the ear relating to hearing. Read that again. Do you see any problems with this? They're saying that this particular fossil is the ancestor of modern whales. But notice something. These creatures were land mammals. They didn't even live in the water. The only way that they claim that these are ancestors to modern whales is that this creature and a whale have similar ears and hearing features. Doesn't that seem a little strange to you? That this creature that lived on land and happened to have an ear like a whale, they're claiming is the ancestor of whales. I find that very hard to believe. But let's continue on here. They say that the skull shown here displays the nostrils at the front of the skull. Well, in the modern day whale, the nostrils are at the top of the skull. Since they believe that the Pakicetus is the ancestor of the modern gray whale, they would expect to find some intermediate link showing the nostrils moving from the front of the skull to the top of the skull. Well, on their website, they have this little button here to click here to meet the intermediate. And yes, indeed, you find this other fossil between today and 50 million years ago that does have the nostril at the middle of the skull. So, this is what I would consider what you would think would be their best example of an intermediate link. And just because the nostrils have moved up the skull, they feel that the fossil record is providing this intermediate link. But the problem here is the fact that why are they making the assumption that this Pakicetus is the ancestor of a gray whale when it didn't even live in the water? I find this very amazing, and I think that their claim that the fossil record is filled with transitional forms and intermediate links is very suspicious, because what they're doing is taking things that don't necessarily fit and causing them and calling them transitional forms or intermediate links.